This is Worldview live from our studio in Johannesburg. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we take a look at the just ended budget speech of South Africa, and this year's national budget is the first since 1994 that increased taxes to raise revenue structurally rather than the usual increases in sin taxes or specific tax changes motivated by some policy objective. With load shedding, labour disputes and unemployment plaguing South Africa's economy, it is reported that Finance Minister Katsande will need an extra 12 billion rand to fund this year's budget. Alternative measures have been proposed to increase South Africa's tax revenue without changing VAT. The minister is also expected to dedicate a large section of his budget to solving the power crisis, with the latest GDP figures showing that the economy is battling to grow. Statistics South Africa say the country's economy grew by 1.5% last year, down from 2.2% in 2013. With labour issues and the power crisis, two major obstacles to growth. Wednesday's budget was seen by many as the most important in 2 decades. And right now, let's just take a listen to what the minister had to say in his speech delivery.
Citrus and tree nuts, tourism and related services, oil and gas development, communications and information technology also offer many opportunities. Although our fiscal position is constrained, there are considerable financial strengths on which South Africa's growth strategy can build. First, interest rates have remained moderate, which reflects the credibility of fiscal and monetary policy and the favorable inflation outlook. The capital market rates at which government and the corporate sector borrow have declined over the past year, signaling continued investor confidence in the South African economy. Secondly, the exchange rate depreciated by 11% against the US dollar in 2014, after declining by 15% in 2013. This, coupled with low inflation, contributes to our trade competitiveness and partially offsets the deterioration in commodity prices. South Africa has a buoyant, which is the third point, capital market. It is open to foreign investors and is a major contributor to direct investment elsewhere in Africa. Our banks and other financial institutions are well capitalized. Our company law and tax frameworks are robust, and we have excellent property market institutions. The first phase of implementation of the National Development Plan is elaborated in government's medium-term strategic framework. If we remain united and energized around its implementation, government, labor, business, and all South Africans, we will continue to make progress towards a just and prosperous future. A sound budget framework is one of the enabling conditions for implementation of the National Development Plan. Fellow South Africans, it has now been 8 years since the global financial crisis began. In responding to low economic growth, government allowed for continued expenditure growth and a wider budget deficit to cushion the economy from a potential hard landing, which would have resulted in an increased debt burden on the state. Fiscal room created during the economic boom leading up to the financial crisis cushioned us against tax increases as a first response. Our fiscal rebalancing has included cost containment measures and intensified efforts to improve efficiency and expenditure. These measures are yielding positive results already. However, growth performance remains weak and substantial repayments of debt are becoming due. It is now clear that we can no longer postpone consideration of additional revenue measures. In choosing among our tax options, the financial health of households and businesses is a primary consideration.
Well, that was the Finance Minister, Katsande. Joining me in studio tonight is Patrick Kuana, a business analyst and transformational entrepreneur here in South Africa. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Yvonne, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely, always a pleasure to have you in our studio and analyze this, because we always analyze it from a different perspective. I like what you said earlier before we started the program, that there is a worldview, and you said there is a
kingdom view.
A kingdom view. So that's what we're doing here tonight. We're doing the kingdom view, analyzing it and breaking it down. Well,
Yes.
after the finance minister's speech, everybody has been talking about personal taxes being raised instead of corporate tax. Now, so is increasing the top marginal tax rate for individuals a better option?
Well, Yvonne, before I even answer your question, let me take one quick step back, because I think this step will really give us a good framework to begin to work with. And because we are looking at this whole situation from a kingdom perspective, I think it's important that I quickly run into the Bible quickly, just to give everybody a nice framework in terms of what we're going to do. Now, this is a government budget speech. It's government, it's finances. Now, the Bible tells us very clearly how the foundation of government is based on righteousness and justice. And I'll refer back to these two things as we answer the questions. The next thing is understanding that in Genesis 1:28, God gives us a very clear economic mandate to steward everything that we have in the service of God and in the service of man, which is absolutely what this budget is trying to do. So to answer your first question around, so is it about income tax? What is it really all about? If we look at the foundation of righteousness and justice, I believe a critical element of the budget is understanding, are we stewarding what we already have? Because if we're not stewarding correctly what we already have, we might be trying to get sources of income from elsewhere rather than actually using the sources that are already available but are being lost because we're not stewarding well enough what we currently have. So I totally believe that one of the things that was perhaps missing is a clear picture as to how, as South Africa, are we stewarding well what we already have and how we're preserving the income that's being lost, that shouldn't be lost through corruption and all these other things. So from that perspective, I think it's really tough that the people of South Africa have to bear the brunt of bad stewardship.
Okay, so having said that, increasing the marginal tax rate for individuals as opposed to corporate tax, like what Julius Malema was arguing, that why should they raise the personal tax instead of the corporate tax? How do you relate to that?
From my perspective, I think raising personal tax is really beginning to kill the growth element of the economy. Because as soon as you put the burden upon the individuals, you're literally starting to kill off the very source of where entrepreneurial and economic activity should be coming from. Taxing businesses, on the other hand, gives you, I believe, an opportunity to deal with a lot of the injustices that are within the corporate sector. Because again, if you look at it, I was just reading a report that was written by the Global Financial Integrity Organization, and they were talking in terms of $81 billion being lost out of the South African economy based on businesses that are actually trading illegally, mispricing, appropriating funds
Running
overseas.
away from the SARS
Absolutely,
tax.
instead of putting that money back to stimulate and generate economic activity. So it's really hard for individuals to take the brunt of that.
Is this something that we see more often in different countries, more, not just really South Africa, where you have corporate businesses running away, changing figures, you know, hiding papers, doing all sorts of unscrupulous things just to run away from the taxman? Is it something that we often see happening in different countries?
Unfortunately, it's a trend that we see a lot in Africa. And it all comes back again to the situation where Africa, because of the legacy of colonialism, because a lot of big business is business that has come out of Europe, wherever that business has come from, they still have an interest to get a lot of the profits that they make back to their original countries of formation. So we find a lot of companies in the mining sector and a lot of companies in the foundational industries getting a lot of profitability out of Africa, but finding ways of getting that profit back to their mother countries and effectively, I would call it, robbing Africa of the abundant wealth that God has given us. So I really believe there's a lot that needs to be done around the corporate sector, and especially around how profits are removed out of Africa and we don't see the benefits of what's happening here in Africa.
Now, still on the issue of the corporate factor, there has been growing reluctance to invest in new ventures in South Africa particularly. And the fact that businesses have been holding on to their cash, just like you said, rather than investing it and hence taking it abroad instead of investing it in the country where they're actually operating their business, and has ensured their survival. This is according to most. This is how they survive. This is how they keep afloat of whatever inflation or anything that might be happening in the economy. Does the budget make business more confident?
I think, Yvonne, business right now, the general global economic climate is one that's really being driven by fear. And again, you look at these reports that have just come out with the leaked intelligence reports
Cables,
and
that's
all
right.
these things. See, these are all the things that make people very jittery in terms of, well, do I really want to put my money in or don't I? I think the turmoil that we've seen in the labor market, with the longest strike ever running last year in the mining industry, that again gives people a lot of jitters. So I think there are some fundamental things that are unfortunately happening right now, both locally and in the global economy, that are giving people a lot of jitters. But at the same time, I really think that government can be doing a lot more to attract those businesses to release that money. And that could be incentives, more locally based incentives in terms of what government can do for businesses that use that money locally, rather than trying to either keep it banked away somewhere or shipped back overseas.
Now, unemployment remains the single greatest economic and social challenge. The government says it continues to prioritize the measures and aimed rather at generating employment. These include the tax incentives that we've just had from the finance minister for employment and investments, support for enterprise development and skills development, and employment programs. Is this enough to turn around the situation of the growing unemployment instead of growing employment rate that we're seeing in South Africa currently?
I think on that one, what I would like to do is take another kingdom view on this. And I'm purposely going to use a parable that Jesus gave us, where in Matthew 25, he talks about the parable of the talents. And he says, listen, the master comes and he gives talents. One, he gives 10, the other he gives 5, and the other he gives 1. And he comes back and he says, what have you done with what I gave you? The one who made a profit with what he had been given, the master then says, well, you know what, let me give you even more because you've done well with what you've got. So let me come back to the issue of growth. I believe when we're in a position where we can steward well what we currently have, we set ourselves up for a foundation to begin to grow. For as long as we are not managing what we have well enough from a kingdom perspective, God doesn't open up the doors for us to grow. And I really believe South Africa as a nation, because of the scourge of corruption, because of the scourge of how investment flows are being curtailed because of a lot of the issues that we've talked about, we are not managing well enough what we currently have. And therefore, that already puts, I believe, a spiritual blockage towards us being able to grow. So let's come back to the budget speech. We're trying to create more jobs, but creating more jobs will only happen when we have an economic growth rate of at least 5 to 6 to 7%. Right now, I think we're talking in terms of below 2. I think
Yes,
that's
that's
the
below.
number.
Yes, we're hovering below 2%, at most 2.2%.
Absolutely. That level of growth, it's impossible to create jobs. That's the reality of it. So I think what we really need to be looking at as a country is, how do we manage well enough what we've got? Because out of that, we will start to see economic growth happening, and out of that, jobs will be created. So it's a cycle, but that cycle starts off with being good stewards of what we have. And I don't think we've stewarded things well enough.
But is there a chance to somehow maybe nature that stewardship and do something right? We're looking at 3 finance ministers that have come and gone, starting from Trevor Manuel, Praveen Gordhan, and then now we have Minister Nhlanhla Nene, who seems to have bear the brunt of having to increase the taxes as opposed to his predecessors. Hence, he is now well known. This is a name that he will carry forever. The finance minister that increased the taxes and made people's lives a bit more difficult. But does his radical approach seem better as compared to the other finance ministers that we've seen? Is this a more, is this an approach that is looking set to actually generating the income that is what, 17 billion rand that he needs to add onto the economy to improve it?
I think, Yvonne, you've mentioned a critical point, and unfortunately, I believe Finance Minister Nene, he's probably sitting at the end of a chain, and he almost has nothing else that he can do. His hands, I believe, are absolutely tied because of a train of problems that now sits on his shoulders. But I believe that is something that has happened all the way from 1994. And I think, as Mr. Nene pointed out, even in the budget speech, we are at a point where something very drastic has to happen because the budget has to balance. There's no question marks around it. But because of the bad management of the current resources, again, as I said, look at statistics that say $81 billion was lost out of the South African economy.
That is quite a huge figure.
If you look at that, that is so much more than the 17 billion that he was looking for. So if only we had managed our resources and our budget well enough and the resources of the nation well enough, we would never need to be asking of the people to be bringing it in. So, but what does the finance minister do now? It's a long process to try and bring these things in check. And I think he was trying to do that when he talked about